Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the College of Humanities, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, I want to extend a warm welcome to all participants for setting time aside to participate in today's really crucial presentation. As we all may already know, illicit drug use is a global phenomenon, and its impact is felt on various dimensions of our lives. And these range from health to crime to poverty and, of course, unemployment. Today, we are graced with the presence of Professor Mark Hunter, a renowned academic and researcher from the University of Toronto in Canada, but also very significantly, a UKZN alumnus. Professor Hunter has researched and published extensively on the issue of drugs in South Africa. Hence, his discussion today is not just a contemporary topic within a South African context, but it also shows us the connection between drugs and unemployment. We're also aware that internationally and locally, illicit drugs is crippling the end user, who oftentimes is the poor, marginalized, and unemployed person. I would now like to welcome Professor Hunter and hand us over to him to engage us on drugs at work, connections between work, unemployment, and drugs from the 19th century to the era of Whoonga. Welcome, Professor Hunter, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I'd first like to thank the organizers, especially Professor Nirmala Gopal and Rakshika Sibran. What I'm going to present is still work in progress. I still have a lot to learn, including from colleagues here. I am, of course, a white outsider, which adds an extra layer of distance that needs to be acknowledged. In terms of the format, I'm going to start my talk, and then after around 20 minutes, present a few slides, and then carry on with my presentation and then take questions. In a nutshell, I'll be framing the talk in terms of the following question. How does drug use change in a country once desperate for wage labor, but now marked by youth employment rates of more than 50%? Drawing on oral histories, ethnography, and archival sources in Durban, I argue that a gradual but significant change in drug use took place from drugs being used as forms of leisure and coping in relation to arduous and racist wage work, to drugs absorbing the stresses of an economy marked by massive youth unemployment and precarious work. It's this connection between unemployment and drug use, the context, that often takes a back seat compared to narratives focusing on the changing supply of drugs. For instance, stories about drug busts, drug kingpins, or new drug crazes. My framing also raises important questions about the dearth of rehabilitation facilities in South Africa. I'm going to come on to this at the end of the talk. I want to start with a very simple question. What is a drug? In the English language, drug is often contrasted to medicine. One is legal, one is illegal, one is legal. One bad for you, one good for you. Another common contrast is between legal and illegal drugs. So alcohol and tobacco being the most obvious legal ones at the moment and taxed, and cannabis, cocaine, etc. being designated as illegal. As has been stated a number of times, these clear divisions are actually hard to justify because we're sometimes talking about essentially the same substances. For instance, in the US and Canada, there's been an explosion of people dependent on prescription opioids, the so-called opioid epidemic, given by doctors to alleviate pain. But actually, these are very similar to heroin or Whoonga. Heroin itself was once marketed by Bayer Pharmaceutical Company as a wonder drug, less addictive than morphine. The drugs sometimes given to children to treat ADHD are stimulants and have some similarities to crystal meth or tic. Alcohol was banned in the Prohibition era in the US, but now is enthusiastically advertised and widely available. Though mind-altering substances do, of course, differ greatly in terms of the harm they can cause, we need to think critically and historically about why certain substances are banned and not, seen as drugs or medicines, and ultimately used by individuals. The context for drugs again, no more so than in South Africa. In a region where white settlers held substantial power, race played an important part in the history of mind-altering substances, and this was very closely tied to work, hence the theme of this talk. As in other colonial settings, European settlers saw the benefits of exchanging or selling drugs to create relations of dependency and to increase the amount or the intensity of labor. Being able to supply someone with a substance on which they're dependent gave a person power then as now, in the workplace and outside. Indeed, South Africa's minerals revolution and apartheid system were famously drug-fueled, with mining companies providing beer to workers, farmers paying workers in dots or tots of wine, and municipal beer halls given a monopoly over sorghum beer sales in cities. At the same time, employers were conflicted because alcohol could reduce profitability. Mines and other employers became part of the voices that called to restrict the availability of alcohol to workers classified as African. And indeed, so-called European liquor became banned from Africans until 1962. This itself fueling a massive informal market in alcohol, a huge amount of work around the informal production of alcohol. So to summarize this first part of the talk, the development of capitalist work relations, a system of racial rule, apartheid, and a large informal economy was closely tied with mind-altering substances, especially alcohol, but also cannabis. When it came to those classified as African, the state didn't focus simply on the substance, for instance, debates about is alcohol good or bad, should we ban or not cannabis or cocaine, but focused on the person's race, therefore making race a determinant of who could ingest what. Among isiZulu speakers in the region, however, there was a much more grounded and sophisticated way of talking about mind-altering substances, one also that became increasingly associated with work. Although Black and white society was differentiated and involved many approaches to substances, an emergent proletariat drank alcohol, often stronger drinks than before, and smoked cannabis to create new sociabilities and cope with arduous and dangerous work. And there's a lot of history, social history written about this, which is somewhat forgotten today, which I tried to link to the current era. Records going back to the 19th century show that uchwala or sorghum beer and insangu cannabis were not seen to be inherently good or bad. Whether they were accepted depended on users' age, gender, location, etc. Uchwala provided sustenance and brought people together, and insangu could be smoked to provide focus at work. Yet neither substance were generally seen as appropriate for young people. Thus, in this moral economy, and as mines and cities were built, the word isidakwa, when applied to wage earners consuming alcohol, disparaged someone not simply who got drunk, that's what it typically means. After all, drinking could dull the pains of migrant work, but someone whose excessive drinking had grave social consequences. One of these would be to bunguka or abandon the home. So there's a moral economy around alcohol. There was not a binary yes or no, but about the consequences. Today, the most common word used for drugs is idakamizwa, a word that seems to have come into use around the 1970s, shows continuities in meanings, ukudaka, to intoxicate, and imizwa, feelings. However, it also reflects the expansion of substances that came to constitute drugs, from cannabis and alcohol, the long-standing ones, to include mandrax, cocaine, ecstasy, and heroin as well. Isidakamizwa does not, unlike the English term, usually describe drugs prescribed to treat illnesses. For this reason, isidakamizwa, substances that intoxicate the mind, is, I think, a better focus word than its English translation, drugs. I will return to the question of how we think about mind-altering substances from a South African perspective later, but I now want to focus on some specific drugs or isidakamizwa. For much of the 20th century, South African drugs was a story of ensangled cannabis and alcohol, as I've mentioned. To a degree, the recent history is often told of one of increased drug supply as South Africa opened its borders to goods and people after apartheid. And this has much truth. If you have more drugs coming into a country at the right price, they will be used. But I also think that the way drug supply became connected to work and increasingly unemployment is important. I could focus on a number of drugs at this point, including alcohol and cannabis or newer ones such as cocaine or crystal meth. But I want to focus on 3 drugs that I think capture some key changes in society, especially the rise of unemployment: Mandrax, Whoonga or heroin, or sometimes called sugars, and Xanax or alprazolam, the latter 2 that exploded over the last 10 years with quite devastating effects in communities. So just to repeat and put it in other words, I'm not focusing on supply of drugs. This would be linked particularly to post-1994 opening of the borders. If you turn on Netflix, you'll see many stories about El Chapo and Escobar. You'll see stories in South African media about drug busts, about immigrants selling drugs. All of this would focus attention on 1994 and particularly the supply of drugs. But I'm kind of thinking more about how did drug use change? What are the experiences of drugs? And this allows me not to focus just on 94, but to go back to the 70s, to unemployment, and to think critically about the social context of drugs beyond simply supply. So to come to the first drug then that I'm going to focus on, Mandrax or Ngidi in isiZulu. Mandrax was first produced as a pharmaceutical product to aid sleeping, but from the 1970s, South Africa emerged as the leading country in its misuse. In the US and elsewhere, it was taken orally as a recreational drug, and it was dubbed disco biscuits, whereas in South Africa, the tablet came to be crushed and smoked with cannabis in a white pipe that gives an immediate hit so strong it can make someone pass out. After the drug's banning in the 1970s, the drug has been produced illicitly inside and outside the country. And as I say, South Africa is the only country with the level or history of Mandrax being used to the extent that it was. Mandrax is relevant to this paper because it arguably represents an incremental shift from drugs allied with formal work, that is, drugs used at work or as recreation from work, the classic drugs, as I've mentioned, being alcohol and cannabis, to drugs used by schoolgoers or recent leavers who might struggle to find work. Mandrax, or buttons, as it's sometimes called colloquially, was associated in Durban at first with working class Indian classified areas. Some of the earlier users smoked it after work, but it increasingly became used by those who dropped out of school and fell into the habit of smoking it with friends. The Zulufied word ibatini, after buttons, which I've seen recorded in the 1990s, suggests that the drug traveled from English to isiZulu speaking worlds, whereas Ngidi, which came to be a common term, indicates Mandrax's potency, because Ngidi means a lock. So it sort of means people are locked when they take Mandrax, and that's why people can pass out. In the late 1980s, the apartheid state probably increased its circulation under the control of the notorious Wouter Besson, who headed the apartheid state's secret chemical and biological warfare project. In the 1990s, it was increasingly manufactured illicitly in Southern Africa, and its sourcing extended from India to China and other countries. Its legacy is not just the introduction of a powerful drug that gained ground on the terrain of unemployment, but large amount of money associated with the drug trade, and therefore the growth of violent turf war among dealers and the paying off of police, both at senior levels, but also junior levels where police can stop merchants for lunch money. Clearly, Mandrax constituted a big step up from cannabis in Sango in terms of profits. But to a degree, it's been taken over by the stronger and more profitable drug, Whoonga or heroin, a drug that fed further on unemployment and would not have spread so quickly had it not been for the supply networks and use of Mandrax. So let me turn now to the second drug, Whoonga or heroin. Heroin use was reported in Durban's former Indian areas from around the early 2000s and from the late 2000s and 2010s in formerly African townships. The media often talked about or implied that there were essentially two different drugs, sugars in Indian areas, Whoonga in African areas, and gave a lot of attention to the mixing agents. So a lot of the early stories talked about how sugars was mixed with rat poison, and a lot of the early stories about Whoonga discussed how it was apparently mixed with antiretrovirals. This served to hide the basic reality that cheap heroin had flooded into the city. Driving the rapid uptake of heroin was the southern route, what's called the southern route of smuggling, where heroin came from Afghanistan to East Africa, Southern Africa. Some of it leaked out at these stages, and also then to Europe and the US. The word Whoonga comes from the Swahili word unga for the drug. Despite the attention often given to central Durban, and in particular to Whoonga Park, if you Google Whoonga, you'll find so many stories on Whoonga Park, the vast majority of heroin is used in the massive black townships of the city. There are strong similarities between dynamics in former Indian, colored, and African areas, but here I focus on interviews with Whoonga users and their families in and around Umlazi Township. Almost all Whoonga users are young men aged between 20 and 29. Those I interviewed tended to have done poorly at school, none matriculated, and half started to use the drug while attending high school. To put it simply, heroin has risen in areas where there was not a clear path to formal work. That is to say, shockingly high youth unemployment rates of more than 50%. If Mandrax opened the door to young people who saw little positive future in their life, Whoonga pushed tens of thousands of people through it. Most heroin users started by smoking Whoonga mixed with weed, and then went on to chase the dragon, that is, burn Whoonga on tin foil and inhale and smoke the fumes. While many had at times committed petty crimes, including stealing from their own families, media portrayals of young addicts living off crime are flawed because crime is an unreliable means of securing regular amounts of money compared to piecework. Whoonga users can get up early to work and work diligently. I have to stress this point. Most heroin users work very hard and undertake socially useful labor. I have a table where I'll show you some of the work that Whoonga users undertake later. As an aside, there's a very interesting book by an anthropologist, a late anthropologist now, David Graeber, called Bullshit Jobs, that is talking about all of the jobs in the economy that really where people don't do anything, particularly white-collar jobs. Those are not the jobs that Whoonga users do. They are washing cars, cleaning yards, washing taxis, collecting scrap, collecting water, repairing things. These are socially useful jobs. It's important to note that Whoonga users are generally not from poor, but not necessarily the poorest communities, which tend to be rural areas with little excess money. This work requires a circulation of money. While some Whoonga users live on the streets, most live with families. The work many undertake is described as hustling in English and ukupanta in isiZulu. This work has similarities to other local casual work, itohu, for instance, the weekly paid temporary work that someone might do in one of South Durban's factories, because it does not allow a person to build a viable future. This work would be more characterized by the term ukusebenza. It's more seen as a higher status form of work that can lead to something. Itohu, casual work, typically doesn't. However, what hustling jobs Whoonga users undertake all have in common is that they allow heroin users to integrate income generation with the repeated purchases of 25 Rand, typically in Umlazi, heroin capsules. This is important because heroin generates a feeling of euphoria and well-being, but unlike Mandrax, heroin leads to painful withdrawal symptoms called arosta, which is again a Swahili word, that includes stomach cramps, aching bones, and difficulty sleeping. And I want to turn to a drug, Xanax or alprazolam, which talks to the nature of schooling when it's been partially delinked from work because of mass unemployment. So I'm keeping this focus on unemployment. I'm pivoting slightly to schooling, and the drug I'm looking at is Xanax or alprazolam. In 2019 and 2022, I undertook a series of interviews in 15 schools, 11 of which were in Umlazi Township. Almost every learner I spoke with said that Xanax, alprazolam, an anti-anxiety prescription drug, had spread extremely rapidly through Durban's schooling system in the previous year before my first visit, that is 2018 to 2019, is when it was said to have really taken off in Durban. Many said that it was the second most popular drug in schools after cannabis or weed. It's cheap, bought for 5 to 7 rands a pill, and students can take as many as 5 or 6 pills a day. When I went back earlier this year, it's, if anything, the use has increased in schools. It's a generic pill manufactured by Mylan that is circulating and seems to be diverted from pharmacies, but also further back in the supply chain. I'm not aware of any country where Xanax or alprazolam is used so much in schools. Amphetamines as stimulants have long been used by students around the world because they prolong wakefulness and therefore hours of study. But Xanax, a benzodiazepine used to treat anxiety, is said to relax and distract and not stimulate a person, and therefore its use demands a different framing. The biggest single reason why learners say they take Xanax is to distract them from their problems. Let's take a step back and consider the schooling system. Again, some more context. Like many nations, although amplified because of its apartheid past, South Africa places a strong emphasis on encouraging more learners to study for longer periods. While the education system remains extraordinarily unequal, more than 400,000 students each year do now pass the secondary school matric exam. Herein lies a paradox, one manifest in the pressures learners face in many parts of the world. Students know that when they have less formal education than others, they will be penalized in the labor market, but working hard at school, sometimes accruing large monetary and social debts, does not guarantee that a person will attain desirable work. In this context, learners state that some can use drugs to get through the school day, whether to promote fun, camaraderie, distract a person from their problems, or simply to make time pass quicker. They're taking Xanax, they're not dropping out of school as they would do if they took a stronger drug like heroin or Mandrax. They're taking Xanax knowing that it's a way that they can stay within school. It allows them, it enables them to stay in school, even if they're not engaging in the way that other students might do. Xanax is part of a school counterculture, but it's important to recognize that its use, therefore, does not fundamentally challenge the foundations of schooling. It's used while students attend class, like weed, and it's said to be taken less around the time of exams and more on Fridays. That is the start of the weekend. Xanax and weed are clearly distinguished by learners from heroin and Whoonga, or heroin or Whoonga, and Mandrax or Ngidi, which are presented as powerful drugs that might cause someone to leave school. The popularity of cannabis, the most commonly used drug in schools, according to everyone with whom I spoke, a drug sometimes used to boost the effects of Xanax, needs to be underlined. The long-standing growth and use of cannabis led the Constitutional Court to effectively decriminalize the drug. Teachers I spoke with tended to relay the negative effects of cannabis on learners, describing those who returned from break time after smoking as sitting in a dreamy state at the back of class. However, learners also described how weed, particularly certain strains, could enhance concentration and therefore the ability to work. Xanax is not associated with aiding concentration in the same way as weed can be seen as negative or positive in terms of schoolwork, but it does exceed or enhance the distracting qualities of weed. For this reason, several students said that it made learners like zombies, and one said it put them in la-la land. One significant difference between Xanax and weed is the former's more favorable reputation among female learners. It's notable that pharmaceutical products are coded as less masculine than other drugs, in part because they can be taken discreetly, unlike cigarettes and weed, which are smoked and leave a person smelling of smoke. Learners frequently noted that Xanax finds favor among young women as well as men. And this is consistent with surveys finding that over-the-counter prescription drugs are the only category used almost equally by young South African women and men. In contrast, half as many schoolgirls compared to schoolboys admitted to smoking tobacco, and a third admitted to using cannabis, according to one study. Okay, I'm going to just move now to a couple of slides just to illustrate some of the points that I've been making. So I'm going to share my screen. So the first slide is a familiar one for historians, and this is a beer hall in Durban. And as many people will know, the apartheid government banned the production and sale of sorghum beer in cities. This is why you had so many illegal shebeens in areas like Cato Manor and Kumbane. And the only lawful place where workers could get sorghum beer outside of work was in beer halls. And beer halls generated massive profits for the city. So in a sense, the growth of the Durban city and the administration was partly funded by beer. In fact, the money was plowed into institutions that promoted segregation. So beer, which was in these halls located next to workplaces, was a key component of the building of the city. This, again, would be familiar to many people. It's the farm and the so-called top or dot system where workers were partly paid in wine. Now, often these histories are kind of thrown away and said, oh, this was apartheid, you know, this is just what happened then. But if I show you this picture that I took from Durban a few years ago, this is a common sight in Durban's townships early in the morning. So these are Whoonga users who are undertaking casual work, in this case, restocking a shebeen, but as I will give examples of, all sorts of casual work, often starting very early because Whoonga creates withdrawal symptoms that are very painful. So when Whoonga users wake up in the morning, the first thing they need is Whoonga to get rid of that pain, and to get Whoonga, they need work. So what I did was I noted some of the work that Whoonga users typically undertook. Washing private cars, cleaning the yard or treka, local building work, washing taxis, scrap, and so forth. And most of the money for Whoonga comes from this kind of work. So some of it will come from stealing, but that's not where, despite the stereotypes, that's not where most of the money for Whoonga comes from. It's not a secure, regular supply. And of course, there's big consequences if you're caught stealing. Now, this is the this was products confiscated by a school in Durban, and you can see the Mayaland's alprazolam 1 milligram, which I've seen a number of different places in different schools in Durban, and I think also elsewhere in South African schools. And the pills are nicknamed by learners Baby Blue Mayaland. So you can see that there's a consistency of how a particular product by Mayaland is being diverted into schools. I've tried to find out more about how this happens. Maybe there's investigative journalists who want to dig into this deeper, because Mayaland hasn't yet answered my emails, but I believe it's being diverted from distributors, certainly from pharmacies, but also perhaps at a larger level by distributors or by corruption within the distribution system, possibly also from the manufacturing plant as well. So that's Mayaland, which took off in 2018-19, and the price has stayed pretty stable at 5 to 7 rands, which suggests that there's a very steady supply that is going into schools. And if you think of how many schools, there are secondary schools there are in just Durban, I mean, Umlazi Township itself is 27, you're talking about a large number, thousands and thousands of pills being taken each day. Now, these are just some slides to give you a sense of how Xanax and also the other drugs that I touch on are thought in relation to one another by learners. So a first kind of line I draw is, the cost and availability of different drugs. That clearly affects how they're used. And Xanax it's cheap and it's easy to conceal. There's no smoke. And other drugs are more expensive or they're harder to conceal. A second line would be, how much does the drug distract learners from their problems, which is how students would talk about drugs. And I have a line between moderate antidespondents or strong antidespondents. And Xanax is not at the bottom, but it's stronger, seen as stronger than cannabis, but it's clearly less strong than Mandrax or Whoonga, which would lead somebody to drop out of school. And the third line I draw is the gendered aspect of the drug. And I think what's distinctive about Xanax is that it's seen as appropriate for both women and men, whereas there's a gender coding around other drugs that typically they're seen as more masculine. There's variations to this, but heroin and Mandrax are particularly seen as drugs that young men would use and not women. So I'm going to end the screen sharing, and I can obviously take questions on any of these, and now come on to the question of interventions in the last 5 or 6 minutes or so. So I now want to bring some of the above points together with national drug policy and offer some humble conclusions. As we've seen, mind-altering substances, especially in Sangu and Utwala, have been used for centuries in the region. In the apartheid era, tens of thousands of Black South Africans were imprisoned for producing or drinking beer or smoking in Sangu. After apartheid ended, South Africa's drug policy is, despite its racist roots, largely marked by continuity. On the ground, the police and criminal justice system continues its punitive approach, especially targeting poor Black users. Between 2005 and 2015, drug arrests increased by over 180%. The state's overriding approach to punish rather than treat drug users shapes the everyday drug landscape in communities. From the 2010s, the powerful term amapara exploded in use to describe disheveled Whoonga addicts. Some say it comes from parasites, some say from paramedics. Parasites would refer to how people are seen to be living off others, stealing even the smallest items in the house. Amapara, so-called amapara, can be treated violently, beaten if a cell phone or something else goes missing in a community, even if it wasn't them. Yet the fact that violence against amapara has not reduced the use of heroin in communities, and putting people in prison for using drugs can place them on a pathway to more drug use, not less. An alternative approach becoming common around the world would fall under the umbrella of harm reduction. It's not pro-drug, to be clear, and therefore does recognize the terrible social consequences that drugs can have. However, rather than stigmatizing users, it starts from trying to understand the experience of drug users. What is notable in the current landscape, extraordinary and indefensible, is that there are almost no rehabilitation centers in Black areas. Here I need to explain how state interventions intersect with the labor perspective that I provided. So I described how at a time of labor shortages, employers use drugs, notably alcohol, whether dops of wine in the Cape or sorghum beer on mines, to entice Black workers into labor. Crude laws then came to ban certain substances, European liquor, especially for those classified as African. The white-run apartheid state was primarily, sometimes obsessively, concerned at the use of whites of drug use, which was said to weaken the moral fabric of white society. Young white men, it was feared, were becoming hippies and not good conscripts for military service. This really peaked around the 60s and 70s. Thus, rehabilitation centers were largely built or subsidized by the state for whites. All of them, almost all of them, built in white areas. In terms of addiction and rehabilitation, there was, however, a brief moment when the state showed some concern for Black people, albeit to a degree because Black people were needed as workers. The Durban city supported a center for alcoholism in KwaMashu called KwaSimama, in the late 1960s, though it was eventually folded into Department of Health institutions. Dr. M.V. Gumede, now honored with a memorial lecture at UKZN, played a central part in the running of Kwasimama, and his frustrated letters to the Pretoria government are kept and can be seen in the National Archives. These show not only his commitment to the project, but how the center operated on a shoestring budget. If any student wants to write a master's dissertation, that is a great one, the history of Kwasimama in KwaMashu. Yet on the whole, efforts to treat dependence was incredibly limited in Black areas. As unemployment rose, there was lesser incentive for employers to treat workers with alcohol problems. This history can be explained by apartheid logics, but it's extraordinary today that it remains the case that there are almost no rehabs in Black areas. I've said this several times and I'll say it again. Despite the dramatic rise of heroin and other substances, there are private rehabs in some parts of cities, but they're expensive, often requiring someone to have access to medical aid, that is, to top jobs. It's also difficult to justify the slack regulation on pharmaceutical distribution and sales, as the case of Xanax shows, especially given that the diversion of pharmaceutical products to illicit master kits is actually a long-standing problem in South Africa. So the regulator, SAPRA, doesn't seem to have a lot of concern or time for pharmaceuticals leaking out and into illicit markets. More, it seems to regulate the production and the safety of manufacturing production. Returning to rehabilitation centers, these are not a magic bullet. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Tabani Kobalo, now at UKZN, wrote an excellent PhD on Whoonga users who'd given up, sometimes not using formal rehabs. But what would rehabilitation look like? Some of the models are quite medical, falling under the rubric that addiction is a disease. This is an important framing because it did, for instance, allow addiction treatment to be covered by medical aid schemes for those with this benefit. But such approaches must be blended with others that are more respectful of the history of the area. I'm coming on to the final part of my talk now. Indeed, as I tried to note earlier, South Africa's labour history bequeathed multiple moralities of drug use that can and does provide a reservoir for an array of ways to think about drugs. Young people were discouraged from taking dagga and beer, but migrants could get drunk to endure the hardship of mining labour, though not to the extent that they spent all their money on bongukud or forgot their home. This history is contained today in popular songs such as Babe Udumo's Angisona Isidakwa, I'm Not a Drunkard. The song asks not for quick judgment, but for understanding. I'm thirsty, or more specifically, troubled by thirst. That's the next line, As I've tried to argue, being troubled by a thirst for drugs in South Africa has deep social roots, most notably today, massive youth unemployment. It's a sad irony that drugs played such an important part in creating the wealth of the country, but that the state has largely abandoned the generation of young men and women who take substances. If you dissect South African capitalism, you'll find drugs everywhere, but you'll also see very little effort to address the consequences of drug use for the poorest South Africans. Worse still, so-called Amapara can be denigrated, beaten up, and even killed, despite the fact that the police's inability to deal with crime is in no small part because of a corruption through drug money. Yet as the popularity of the song Angisona suggests, drug moralities have long been social and contingent rather than binary and individualized. These histories and their connection to political claims for equality and social justice need to be excavated and placed at the center of discussions about the rise of drugs such as Mandrax, heroin, and Xanax. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hunter. So there are two takeaway messages for me. The first one is the pathways to drug use. And the second one is for society, communities, etc., to have a paradigm shift in terms of how drug users are viewed and the kinds of support that they probably need. With that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions and answers. I have a list of names here in the meantime. Mafikeni, you can ask your first question because you had posted that quite early in the chat.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Prof, I've got one question for you. What do you think could be done to curb the abuse or the use of these drugs?
Okay, thank you very much, Mafekeni, for that question. I mean, I don't think there's a magic bullet, but I do think, and clearly, you know, part of my talk is saying, you know, it's landed in unemployment, and so, you know, we're back to the same questions that always come up about redistribution, unemployment, and so forth. But I do think that, you know, first of all, I don't think that the state, you know, really recognizes in any meaningful way the level of drug use and the consequences of it. And to come to another question that's in the chat, and something that I've raised many times, you know, there is no rehabilitation, effective rehabilitation. If you go to Mlazi Township, 500,000 people plus live there. There's not a single rehab. So rehabs are not magic bullets, but if you're thinking about state interventions, there have to be a starting point or some state structures to address the problem, and that doesn't exist at the moment. What they look like, how they look like is a matter of debate, but it's very difficult to find. You can go around and you go to the department, you go to a clinic, for instance, and you ask about, you know, what happens about people who are using drugs. And the clinic, of course, is social development is full of grants. You know, grants have taken up a lot of social development, and you have to really work your way around to find who even has technical responsibility for drugs. And then they could put past a person in the queue for a rehab, but you know, people can wait 6 months, a year for a rehab. There's almost none in South Africa. So I do think that the government, you know, really the level of the problem and the response by the government is minimal. And then I would also just I do think, you know, what history shows is it is very difficult to end supply. You know, so the so-called war on drugs in America didn't stop cocaine getting in. And I think it's very difficult because of the multiple ways that, say, heroin comes into the country to stop heroin, you know, and have that as a single solution, which is what governments often tend to focus on. But I do think when it comes to pharmaceuticals, you know, I think that the leaks can be plugged. You know, Xanax is coming from particular sources. And I think if the regulators took an interest in it and researched it, I think that there's a chance that could be plugged, that you've got Xanax all over Durban schools, I think elsewhere as well. But I think that something could be done for that, you know, because it's coming from South Africa, it's a drug, it's leaking out of local distribution. You won't stop it completely because people will always go to pharmacies. There's always a doctor that's going to write a script and pharmacies that are going to give it. But I think that there's some, you know, large scale diversion of Xanax that actually could be plugged, you know, relatively quickly. So I would flag that as something that I think is of utmost importance. But again, it doesn't seem that it's being addressed at the moment.
Thank you very much, Professor Hunter. Let us now give Samira an opportunity to ask her question. Please go ahead, Samira. Okay, whilst we're waiting for Samira, can I, Prof. Hunter, will you please take this question, which is, someone's asking about the relationship between broken homes and moral guidance among youth drug users.
Okay, I mean, that's a complicated question. Let me just also, because somebody also said correctly, yes, there are some treatment centers, Madadeni and also Newlands. So, but so if you're in Umlazi and you get referred, you probably get referred to Newlands, but I mean, it's quite far away and you're in a massive queue. So I'm not saying there are no treatment, but it's just, it's overwhelmingly been historically focused on white areas and it's very small in black areas. But I acknowledge the point that Bongeka is making. So the question of broken holes and moral gutters, I mean, I think it's very complicated because, unemployment always intersects with other elements, and one of these is, for instance, the inability of young people to marry. So to have a kind of meaningful life path whereby, of which marriage is one, but it's not the only one, but where marriage is can be a significant part of that. So in South Africa, marriage rates are among the lowest in the world. They've completely collapsed among poor young people. And that has a whole series of connections to unemployment, and also, I think, in complicated ways to drug use. Because I sometimes talk to people who use, say, Mandrax. They'll say, yeah, I used Mandrax when I was young, but I kind of put it behind me when I was working and I had a family and I wanted to support them. And so there's a kind of dynamic of also leaving drugs that comes with, what is to replace it. The role of the churches is interesting because I think, the churches do actually play a role in rehabilitation and faith groups more widely, including mosques. I think that's a kind of a resource that is there and has to be acknowledged. And I certainly think that there's not one best way of rehabilitation, that church groups and also mosque groups centered on mosques actually can play an important role and are playing an important role in dealing with drugs. Not with much support from the government, but they are actually, as things stand, playing an important role.
Thank you very much, Professor Hunter. So before we move to Prim Naidu, I'd like us to take Professor Dango's hand. He's had it raised for a while. Prof. Dango has left us, then maybe we can move on to Prim Naidu, please.
Hi, Prof. Hunter. Thank you for your webinar. I just wanted to know, what are the problems that these high school learners are facing that they need to turn to drugs? And I'd like to know if you've got any insight both from the rural perspective schools, the township schools, and the private schools in South Africa, or even in Durban. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you. That's a great question and another big one. I mean, problems can range from, family problems at home, poverty, parents, boyfriends, girlfriends, stress at school around exams and marks. So there's all sorts of problems that learners would articulate. But it is common that when you ask students, why are drugs taken? Why do you take drugs? That it's to distract them from their problems. But of course, there are many different problems. I would, without wanting to be reductive, I would say that when you have 50–60% unemployment rates, that frames the kind of problems that learners have compared in certain schools. Now, I've done work in schools in Umlazi, schools in Clarewood, Wentworth, Bluff, and also in Durban North, in the most affluent part of one of the most affluent parts of the city. And I mean, I think that many of the drugs kind of cross between multiple schools. I would say that one kind of exception that stood out would be the most affluent school that I went to, which actually was the school that said they had the biggest drug problem. But they actually did random testing and found that there was actually a tiny number of people who were using dacha, but actually vaping was what they constituted. You know, that was what they were remarking on when they were saying they had a big problem, was that students were vaping. And also steroids, you know, so you have if in boys' schools you have a big problem of steroids that's all to do with the competitiveness of the school and so forth. So there's a kind of array of substances used to varying degrees in South African schools, and I'm sort of not trying to overgeneralize, but if you look at the schooling system, most schools are poor schools. You know, numerically 27 schools in Umlazi. And you know, there's a handful in the former white suburbs. So I would say that, you know, what I'm describing is relatively common, certainly in urban Durban. I don't know about rural areas. I haven't done research there. That's a really good point. I don't think that because of the money needed to circulate, you know, a drug like heroin, you know, where people have to buy it for 25 rand, you know, where's the money going to come from? In a township, people are always willing to pay someone to clean the yard or do the, you know, or help with the construction or something, scrap metal. So but I think, you know, there is a report, you know, there is work done on alcohol and dacha use in rural areas, but I would probably suggest that certainly Xanax would be less used, and some of the other drugs that are more expensive as well. But again, this is research that I haven't done, and you know, I think is needed. You know, is needed this kind of research.
Thank you. Is Zenshlanshla still in the Zenshlanshla still part of the attendees? You can go ahead and ask your question. Whilst we're waiting for Zenshlanshla, Professor Hunter, will you please be able to speak to us about mental health awareness and drug abuse?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a very complicated issue because, you know, some of the first institutionalization of drug users was in, you know, hospitals for mental health, and you know, it's a complicated, a very complicated issue, and you know, it's difficult to simplify. But one thing that I maybe would just say is that when Xanax came out and started to flood schools, one of the things that learners talk about when they describe it is that it's a drug for depression. And you know, I find that sad, but it's hardly any learners will say, you know, this is an anti-anxiety drug, so which is what it's generally prescribed for, Xanax. It can also be described, that can be linked to depression, but predominantly it's an anti-anxiety drug. And but learners will almost always kind of code it as there's this new drug that's come out that is dealing with depression. So again, it comes back to you know, a kind of, I think, thinking about structural issues around mental health. I mean, we talk about this as well in Canada, you know, mental health crisis in education. But I think part of the framing has to be, you know, what is the purpose of education? What does it do? And what expectations do people have at the end of it? It's a lot of work. It goes on for longer than it ever used to do. And the consequences of education compared to the past you need it. You can't get anywhere without it. But then even if you invest so heavily in it, there's a good chance, even with matric, that you're going to end up unemployed. And I think that is a kind of framing of education and mental health that I would like to put to the forefront. Is the kind, of course, there's individual reasons, and there's individual, you know, reasons that psychologists could focus on. It's multi-layered, but the kind of context that I'm trying to put forward to is really, I think, about you know, it's all very well to celebrate matric pass rates going up, more people are getting matric. That's a good thing, but people are not getting work afterwards, and that is a major, that structures the experience of people who are part of the education system, and drug use is intertwined with that.
Thanks, Prof. Hunter. There's a question here. regarding Whoonga. And the question is, does Whoonga in African regions only contain ARVs?
I mean, I think that the way that heroin was reported, was deeply problematic when it first came out in Durban and South Africa more broadly. So the first news stories were about how this was sugars. It was called sugars at first, and how it was connected with rat poison. It was mixed with rat poison. It was mixed with cocaine, and then why would dealers mix it with rat poison? I mean, of course, I'm sure that there was some that was mixed, but because anytime a drug goes down the chain, people will dilute it and mix it with substances to make it go further. But as a drug that it would be, it's a drug with rat poison. So I think there's always been a problematic framing, and then the heroin is almost taken out. And cocaine, why would people mix heroin with cocaine? Cocaine was way more expensive. So I think that and then the kind of narrative, I remember it in 2010, there were all these stories in the media, these new antiretroviral drug, kids are stealing antiretrovirals. I'm not saying that didn't happen sometimes, but it was the same drug, it's heroin. So I don't think that it's been predominantly mixed with antiretrovirals. I think in some instances, no doubt that took place, but I think that these kind of narratives and the way that they get framed were problematic, and that the bigger picture is heroin flooded Durban, and of course it gets mixed with different things at different times, and it gets called different things, but the big story is heroin flooded the city. The other things I see is a bit of distractions, because they occupy so much of the news stories early on, and they were just repeated. People will repeat sugars, a drug of cocaine, heroin, and rat poison, and then the next story just repeats it, and the next story, and the same with the antiretrovirals. It was just repeated and repeated, and I think it misses some of the bigger picture.
Thank you very much. So there's a comment in the chat box which speaks to the issue of the medical model that the National Drug Master Plan, South Africa's National Drug Master Plan, has adopted. And the participant says there's no real proof to show that this is an effective model. Do you want to comment on that, Prof. Hunter?
Yeah, I mean, the model of addiction as a disease, which is centuries old, by the way, it has different reincarnations, and it became particularly prevalent in the post-war period with the support of the WHO and other institutions. It's always been controversial. I mean, I've gone back to some of the archival sources where, for instance, the Temperance Alliance, South African Temperance Alliance, was debating this back in the 1950s and 60s, saying, oh, there's this new model, which this is the advantage of it because it doesn't blame users, so it's not just punishing users, it's actually a useful model. But then on the other hand, is it a disease? If it's a disease, shouldn't we be able to cure it? And how do we cure it? And is there a drug to cure it? So it's always been a controversial model. And I think it's been kind of strategically used in productive ways. So it's been used to promote treatment through medical aid. And I've seen that again in the archives, where you see groups saying, this is a disease, it's a disease, and employers then kind of have to give people sick leave, and they have to then ultimately, it gets funded, treatment gets funded by medical aid. So it has very positive aspects of shifting the compass away from, we should just arrest and imprison users, But at the same time, as the sort of question suggests, it's also got limits. And I would, because clearly it isn't just a straightforward disease. And clearly it's, if you look historically, which is what I've tried to do, you see patterns, you see, why does Mandrax rise so much among this group? Is it just this group is diseased, or is it because of unemployment? And I would choose the latter as an explanation. You know, otherwise, how are you going to understand the rise of certain drugs at certain times and their decline and so forth? And that's why I focus more on the structural issues. But I wouldn't want to kind of completely take away the disease notion, because it serves an important purpose. And I would kind of see sort of layers of understanding of drug use that are mutually compatible, and that you don't need one single model. Same way as I agree, you know, Alcoholics Anonymous, someone said that does work for people. So does faith-based groups, and so does a more medical model work. You know, so I see a kind of plurality of ways. I try to express how in the region of South Africa, isidakamizwa has a particular history and morality around it that I think is important to also stress and to think more about. Yeah, so I mean, the other question so what institutions should deal with addiction issues, and that the Department of Health doesn't, it's social development, but then social development is kind of overwhelmed with grants. So it gets kind of cut in the middle. It doesn't seem that there's and this isn't just South Africa, I think it's common many parts of the world, that it's because of this uncertainty, is it a disease or not? How do you deal with it it often falls between different departments and different institutions within government.
All right, can we have Kensani?
Hi, Professor. I would like to just share my experience with drugs. I know of like a lot of people who grew up in suburban areas who use a lot of drugs compared to in townships, even though research points us to townships as, you know, being one of the people like who use a lot of drugs. But in my opinion, and from what I've seen, a lot of suburban people, kids, are the ones who actually abuse a whole lot of drugs. And then it extends to the workplace when they get the jobs because they are able to obtain degrees. We end up having employers or employees who actually are using drugs, like heavy on drugs, going to your CEOs and your managers. And I feel like research or studies should be focusing on these people in high positions because they really abuse drugs, and not because they have mental health issues or whatever, but because they have the money to buy it and they just like the feeling of it. So I'll just share that experience or my view about drugs and what I've seen really all my life.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and I totally accept what you're saying. That I mean, for instance, you know, cocaine, which is one of the most expensive drugs, you know, was used in the apartheid days, mostly by whites by virtue of income, but it's now spread, you know, it's now a multiracial drug that's spread into the suburban areas and is, you know, relatively widely used. The same with sort of rave drugs like ecstasy and other substances as well. So I totally acknowledge what you're saying. I think you're absolutely right that there is a sort of differentiated patterns of drug use, and that in a sense there are multiple parts of the story that I'm telling, because those drugs, as you say yourself, you know, are used in work. I mean, cocaine is famously used in work, you know, used by the yuppies in the 1980s in the British Stock Exchange, and all sorts of you know, other ways that it's been used, and people still carry on, you know, working productively. So you know, I think that the kind of difference is maybe that you know, cocaine, I mean, there is first of all, if you're working and you have medical aid, then you do have access to help, which you don't have if you're not working or if you're in precarious work. And I think that if you want to, what I'm trying to do is sort of show the big social change. And I think certainly the rise of unemployment has kind of enabled this condition for the spread of other drugs, you know, which aren't, sure, I'm sure there are some middle-class people who use heroin, but overwhelmingly it's used in poorer areas. Pharmaceuticals, again, are very interesting because they've often been diverted to middle-class areas. And indeed, the opioid epidemic in the US is an example of that, of how opioids are used by sometimes middle-class people who become strongly addicted to them. And, you know, which is essentially the same thing as heroin. It's essentially the same drug. So I totally acknowledge what you're saying. And again, it's a sort of call for more research that I think, as you say, is important.
Duduzile, may we have your question, please?
Hello, ma'am. I don't know if I'm breaking the rules or not, but this is not really a question. It's more of like a statement.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I want to say that I come from the township, and I come from like a family that is like, I don't know, very rigid and things like that. And I've struggled with, I'm anxious, and I've struggled with that. And I never know what to do, you know, how to get help. And admit it, like saying it to my family, it's almost like you get peppered with insults, or like people just not acknowledging it, like that. I really think I have I'm anxious, I have anxiety. And I think one of the things that sometimes is happen, by the way, I'm the one who asked about the mental health awareness part, because I just think that sometimes the way we need to cultivate some way of like having mercy and talking with love, or like that, to people who use drugs. Because I went down that road, and when I used drugs, I felt, I lack a better word, I felt normal, and I kept on. But I'm in university now and I'm in treatment, but before I would notice that, you know, there's just this, the way drug users are viewed is so harsh, and it makes it more difficult to even get clean, you know, quote unquote, get clean because of that, even though, and get help as whatever way you can. So I appreciate the talk. Honestly, I appreciate the talk, and I like the way people are humanized, that, you know, someone is going through a struggle and they're not just taking drugs just because they're bored or something, or I don't know what other people, but I took them because every time I took them, it was a miracle. My anxiety went away. It was like, wow. So it took me a while to just be like, I have a mental health problem. Let me ask a psychologist and try. The public clinic has a psychiatrist come in every Thursday. So that's how I'm getting help. And so I appreciate this talk, and I appreciate awareness and love. Look at people with love who are going through addiction. Thank you. Sorry if I talk too much.
No. You absolutely didn't, Duduzile. And thank you. Somebody else, Margot, says, thank you very much for sharing your experience. And I want to echo Margot's sentiments. It does take huge courage, and we're happy to hear that you're on your way to recovery. Mark, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just to honor Duduzile's words and, you know, thank her for sharing them. And, you know, something that came to mind was, I mean, schools are under a huge amount of pressure to to get results. You know, that's the nature of the education system. But there are also some extraordinary teachers in the schools that I know, and I'm sure other people here know, you know, who really do go and make a big effort to listen to learners, and that should be encouraged. And I think that you know, I think that the Department of Education, of course, you know, there's huge targets and everything's about matric and pass rates and everything. But, you know, the reality of an institution like a school is that it has so many multiple sides. And one of them is, or should be, listening to learners, listening to problems with sympathy, with honesty. And I think that does go on in some schools, but the teachers don't get a lot of support because of the pressures, you know, to on matric and everything. So I would also just put that out there as something that I think, you know, there is a lot of care and love that goes on in the schooling system, despite the kind of stereotypes about bad schools and dysfunction. I don't see that in many of the schools that I go to. I see, you know, many caring and loving teachers working very hard for learners. So I think that also has to be acknowledged, and you know, to respond to Duduzile's kind of powerful words.
Thank you very much for that. And Dismissal, can we hear your question, please? Whilst we are waiting for Dismissal, I think my small submission is that it's time perhaps that we stopped problematizing the user and rather look for where the real problem is, and, you know, deal with the cause rather than the symptom. Because I think oftentimes in society, it's easier to deal with the symptom, label drug users, and probably say, let's lock them up and throw away the keys. And I think that mind shift is extremely important for all of us. Dismissal, are you still around? All right, is there anyone else that wants to ask? Oh, sorry, there we go.
Yes, I just wanted to make a quick statement. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to make a quick statement because I'm actually in the northern Natal, the side of Newcastle and Matadeni, and the problem that I'm seeing, particularly with drug users, I know I've heard Professor mentioning Xanax being one of the highly used drugs in schools in the south of Durban. It's also a similar problem in schools in northern Natal, and unfortunately, this problem has found itself to even the deepest rural areas of KZN, where learners are using either Nyaupe or Whoonga. They use the word interchangeably, and together with Xanax, in which they now have created another substance that is known as Nika. What they do, they take the soft drink because it has acid, they combine it with any fruit syrup or with Xanax, and then they drink it, and then they get this relaxation from this. So the question is, maybe it's directed to government, how
It seems as though we've lost Dismissal. Are you able to answer the first part of his question or give a comment to what he has mentioned?
Well, just to note the important point he makes, that Xanax and other drugs, including, I think he was referring to Benylin or cough medicines, when they're mixed with soft drinks, and that's also part of what can happen in schools. But that's also, it's not just a urban problem, it's also spread far into rural areas. And I think that's, again, is an important point. I mean, these substances are not expensive. You know, I mean, R5 for a Xanax pill. So it is something that I think the scale of the problem is not being recognized. You know, and even we look at, you know, you look at the reports as Whoonga Park, it's central Durban, it's Whoonga. that's not where drugs are being taken in KZN in South Africa. You can't just focus all the time on Whoonga Park. It's all over the province and the country, and we need kind of more of these views like Undumiso from those areas, and maybe a bit less of the kind of Whoonga Park type stories.
Tabani Kumala, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? And then we will have Sibasish Lembele.
I would love to, Prof. Professor Mzingeli, Nijanba. Thank you very much for coming over. I was looking forward to this. Unfortunately, I was not able to listen to your first part of your presentation because of other commitments. But two issues that I'd like to contribute on, more probably because they infuriate me. Your presence here at least is going to bring the issue of opioid addiction to the consciousness of the academics, and I'm very happy that you are here because it has been ignored. And I do not know that it's because it affects a particular population that is not as important, or I cannot explain as to why it has been ignored. The last speaker indicated that it's now in rural areas. It's everywhere, and nothing has been done. And as in my input on the national drug about the National Drug Master Plan, and me having an issue with the disease model, we all understand that we are approaching whatever condition from a biopsychosocial and as an African person, cultural as well as spiritual perspectives. That we focus only on the disease model, and that we put only the practitioners that are at the forefront with regards to approaching conditions as diseases, such as that we are silencing everybody else. At this stage, we do not know as to what communities themselves can say. As you rightly indicated, we still, most community members think that their children are smoking ARVs, and they still think that it's a red poison. What I want to say to you, Prof, that there is a research proposal that I'm putting up with the intention of testing the capsules so that we can once and for all hopefully rule out that it's not ARVs and it's not red poison, and as rightfully indicated, it's an opioid, which means, and where heroin is one of those opioids. Quickly, I want to address what Kinsani was saying with regard to the fact that in the suburbs or in the leafy suburb of South Africa, they do more drugs than in the township. The difference is that they are cushioned by their super middle class, or even, let me call it super middle class life. Because even if you were taking Whoonga, you wouldn't be dirty and be chased all over the place by people keen to kill you if you can be able to finance your addiction. Thank you very much. Let me end there.
Thank you, Tabani. Professor Hunter?
No, thanks, Tabani. And for anybody who wants to learn more about especially Whoonga and how users have given up Whoonga, you should read Tabani's excellent PhD, because it's really a masterpiece in understanding and exactly what I think is necessary in South Africa. I mean, I've been going back over some of the archival records, and you find that even the apartheid government was kind of obsessed with models from elsewhere. You know, they were constantly going to conferences, and that's where they got the disease model and everything. And, you know, I think that there is one of the maybe opportunities of a very weak rehabilitation system now is that there is an opportunity to think about what it could look like and reframing it. And that's why I think that, Tabani, your work and other work that starts from the ground upwards and thinks about what interventions can be made from a South African perspective are really important. So thanks, for your comments, and I totally agree. I mean, I think drugs are everywhere. Everyone uses drugs, and when you get down to it, caffeine is a drug, and it's and people who go to pharmacies, but one of the ways that medicines and so-called illicit drugs got separated, and this is really a class issue and it's also a race issue, is that, medicines, there was an oversight to it. So there was there's an oversight to medicines. So actually SAPRA, the oversight agency in South Africa, I mean, they go into factories and they make sure that medicines are what they say they are, that the production process is correct. Whereas illicit drugs are dealt with through the law, and there's no real control over what is there, what it's mixed with, and it's a class issue. And in America, it's there's a lot of history around how it's tied in with race as well, and how this division of licit and illicit was tied in with white and black. And so I think that these questions have to be asked. Again, why are pharmaceuticals, why do they end up in schools? And I think that why does the government regulate certain things, which is the factories that produce drugs do it to a high quality, which affects the middle class, but when it comes to poorer people who are then taking the drugs illicitly and they're thrown around schools, why is there no regulation or almost no regulation of that? That's, I think, again, raises the questions that Tabani's put so eloquently about, the cushioning for the middle class of substances, even though they're taken, compared to poorer South Africans.
All right, we move on to Sipisishle.
Thank you, Professor Gopal, and thank you, Professor Hunter, for this insightful webinar. I also want to submit my why question. Unlike cannabis, Xanax, and Mandrax, I was wondering, why does Whoonga lead to dropping out for the learners?
Okay, thank you, Sipisishle, for that question. Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is because the withdrawal symptoms are particularly severe for heroin, or opioids more generally. So, you have terrible cramps and diarrhea if you don't have heroin and you're used to it. And so that then it's difficult to then go to school in those conditions, compared to, say, Xanax, where you take the drug and you zone out and you can get through the school day. And the second one is that it costs a lot of money, so in Umlazi, it would be sold for 25 Rand. So somebody has to go, that money has to be earned, Xanax, you often find the money will be diverted from, parents or guardians will give a bit of money for snacks at school, and then the 5 Rand gets from that. But 25 Rand is quite a lot of money, and then you've got to have multiple hits a day, including one in the morning. So Whoonga users would talk about how the two most important smokes are late at night, so someone can sleep, and early in the morning, because you wake up with the withdrawal symptoms. Now, how does that fit into a school day? It's quite difficult, and so I think that's why Whoonga is particularly associated with dropping out. Of course, heroin, people can be productive if there's support. So there's opioid substitution therapy, which is given to people who say maybe working. I mean, this has been going on for a number of years in many countries, who can then carry on at work and work productively. So there's nothing inherent about opioids that means that you're unproductive. Indeed, as I kind of tried to show, Whoonga users work extremely hard. I mean, they combine it with, they're not lying on the ground, they're actually working very hard. So there's nothing inherent about the drug, but you need the money, and you need to get a fix early in the morning.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Hunter. I'm just quickly looking at the chat. Ndumiso, do you have another question for us? Ndumiso, yes. All right, I can't, there we go. It seems like I can't locate Ndumiso's question, but with that, I want to, if there are no further questions or comments, I'd like to bring the session to a close. And with that, I would like to say a huge thank you. Okay, Duduzile, do you want to go ahead? Before I officially close the session.
Yes, ma'am. I had one last question in the chat. I want to ask the professor, how do you feel about the rehab center? There is one in Durban, I believe. I don't know about other places in South Africa. And the rehab center rehabilitates people by putting them in a medically induced coma so that they don't go through the symptoms. They're not awake for the symptoms of withdrawal. And I don't know, I think they wake up a week later or something. I'm not a medical student, I don't know, I just saw this, but I thought it was interesting because when people say go cold turkey, I think it's so cruel. I saw this one as a better way, like the medically just make someone sleep through the symptoms of withdrawal. That would be so difficult that they would go back to the drug again. Why not just make it more humane, not cold turkey? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on sort of rehabilitation centers, but my initial reaction would be, it sounds very dangerous to put people in a coma for a week, that there's huge sort of risks with that. And I mean, the other aspect, of course, is, there is, say, for heroin, models of opioid substitution therapy, including in Durban. And, the methadone has been used for many years around the world as a way of sort of dealing with some of the physical aspects of withdrawal symptoms and reducing the amount of methadone given. So there are already sort of established ways. I think the difficulty is that, I mean, people also go to prison and they're cold turkey, and there's all sorts of ways. I mean, Tabani's dissertation shows this, that the physical aspect is, and Whoonga users themselves also reduce the amount that they use over time. They can do, so you'll find a Whoonga user maybe say, I had 10 hits and now I'm down to 3. So there's all sorts of ways that the physical aspect is and can be dealt with. But I think the difficulty is, even when users stop using Whoonga, there's always if the social conditions don't change. I mean, you find people who say they went to a rehab, they stopped Whoonga, even without any substitution, they come back, they live in the same house, same streets, and all their friends are using Whoonga, there's no chance of jobs, they left school without matric. Those things are much harder to change than the medical and the withdrawal symptoms. So, but thank you for sharing that.
Christy Greener, can we please have your question?
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
It's not really a question. It's just a reminder to staff and students that if you require any assistance with substance use challenges, for staff at the university, we have ICAS. So you can contact ICAS to get in touch with relevant healthcare professionals. And then if you're a student, we have student support services in all 4 colleges from first year to PhD. You can get in touch with us and book an appointment and we can start to assist. So it was just a reminder of the resources available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christy, for that important announcement. Margaret here says, Mark, that the main challenge in recovery is not stopping, but staying stopped. And she goes on to explain some of the trigger factors, which are usually emotions and probably peers. Do you want to give us a quick comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. That's what I would, that's also what I've heard people say a lot, and clearly, the fact that AA and NA, have been going for so long and have, I know, spread around the world, shows that aspect of group support and regular meetings, it can be very effective. So, and support groups also have a long history in South Africa, not just for drugs. I mean, if you remember the early 2000s, I mean, there was a proliferation of AIDS support groups. They're often actually very politicized. So the Treatment Action Campaign, had strong connections to HIV support groups. And I often think about it because I studied AIDS before I studied drugs. You had this moment in the 2000s where you had these support groups, and then you had this politicization of the topic, and then it changed government policy, and you had ARVs unroll, from about 2003 and so forth. And then you think about drugs, you think, well, there's no real social, there's not the same kind of social movement, there's not the same kind of support groups. I think it comes back to partly the fact that the government still has an overwhelmingly punitive response, and also a lot of the conversations people have been saying about how drug users are denigrated, how they're criticized, how they're blamed. And that is a kind of cultural shift that I think has to take place. And that's why I think, looking at the history of South Africa, you find that drugs were so central to it, that you can't look at what's happening today and blame people if you look at the history of drugs and drug use in the country and how it's tied up with work and apartheid and so forth. So I think that a similar kind of process has to go to take place, as did with, there was a lot of stigma about HIV/AIDS, but support groups were key to that, to breaking that down, and that hasn't happened yet on a big scale with drugs, although there are times when it happens.
Thank you very much, Mark. I noted that Dismissal speaks about the relationship between drug use and dismissal at the workplace. I'm just wondering, because of time, if Dismissal could write directly to you, and perhaps you could provide her with a response. And maybe that would be an interesting topic to discuss as a follow-up to this one, Prof. Hunter. So I'm putting the challenge out there. And with that, I want to say a huge thank you to Professor Hunter. May we please have a huge round of virtual applause.
Thank you, everybody. It's been great to interact with you.
I think it was greater for us because we got data from the field, and maybe a little bit embarrassing that many of us in the country are not even doing this kind of very important research, Professor Hunter. So thank you to you. Of course, thank you very much to our attendees. Without you, the session would never have been as engaging and as insightful as it has been. I also want to say a huge thank you to corporate relations, and in particular to Masibrin, who always rises to the occasion, makes our lives really easy. Thank you, Rakshika, and thank you to the rest of the team. With that, I'd like to say goodbye to everybody, and hopefully we will see you soon at our follow-up webinar. Thank you, Professor Hunter, and do enjoy Morocco.
Thank you.